Hello, this is Reverend Don Lewis coming to you from the beautiful metaverse, and more specifically from beautiful Danville, Illinois, homeland of the Corellian tradition. And this is Midday with Reverend Don. As you know, if you follow Midday with Reverend Don, you can chat with me from whatever platform you happen to be watching on by typing your questions or comments directly into whatever platform you happen to be watching, and I will see them here on my chat room, and we can talk directly, which is one of my favorite parts of this broadcast. And I hope you're having a lovely day. Today we're going to talk a little bit about pagan funerals. And the reason we're going to talk about this today is that 34 years ago today was my mother's funeral. She had died on September 13th, 1989. The funeral was September 19th, 1989. And in a few minutes, we'll start that conversation. But first, I want to welcome everyone, and I wanted to show you something I found unexpectedly when we opened a box this morning. And these figures are, I guess I'll hold it in this hand. They're like 20 years old. This is a little Santa Claus that I did. And you can see basically what he looks like. And the little Mrs. Claus. You can kind of see what she looks like. And there are a bunch of other figures too. I did these back in the days when I was working with Linden Angels in the late 1990s. And I'm probably going to put them up on my page later for sale. Hello to Janet in the chat room. Hello to Antonio in the chat room. It's good to see you. Welcome. It was very interesting to find these figures because I didn't know they still existed. And you know, as an artist, you have a certain emotional bond to things that you create. It's one thing to watch them go out into the world. It's another for them to just disappear. And hello to Mary in the chat room. It's good to see you, Mary. So I was very pleased to see they still exist. And as I say, I'm planning to put them on my page later today. Yesterday, speaking of artwork, we were going through my new personal altar. I was showing people all the different parts that I currently have on it. And we talked a bit about how I like my altars to be constantly changing, even though many of those pieces are very, very old. And hello to Kai Aiden in the chat room. It's good to see you, Kai. Also, having talked with Kai Aiden last night in my chat room for my Patreon, which I do every Monday, I'm planning to put up some of my mother's remaining pieces of jewelry in the next few days. And Mary says that the talk about the altar was wonderful, and thank you for that. Thank you. I'm glad that you enjoyed it. And hello to Renee and Christine in the chat room. It's good to see you both. It was very nice for me to be able to go through and share those things. So as I say, later today, I'm going to put these figures up on my page. I have some photos from yesterday that I'm going to put up on the page as well. At least that's my intention. And yeah, these are some of the things going on in my life. And if you wish to support my work, remember we have my Patreon at revdonlewis.com. I should be bringing out my newsletter probably this weekend or early next week. We will have our seminar for the month of September coming soon. Lots of things we do at the Patreon. And of course, we also have just recently made available for sale the Corellian Book of the Dead, available for pre-order. So if you're interested in that, you can pre-order that at CorellianPublishing.com. And Kai says, it was great to talk about your altar, and I love to look at other people's altars as it inspires me and mine. You know, that's so very true. I love to see how other people do altars, both for individual rituals or for their personal altars, because you can always get some really good ideas. And hello to Tom in the chat room. It's good to see you, Tom. And I am one Again, I like constant change, constant variety. Hello to Ravenwolf in the chat room. Um, I don't really like for things to always be the same. And that's probably just because I'm a Gemini. And I know that for some people, they have the opposite point of view, and that's perfectly fine. That's why there are so many of us, so we can be different. And wouldn't the world be boring if we weren't? Um, so today, we're going to talk a little bit, oh, and hello to Michael in the chat room. We were going to talk a little bit about the subject of pagan funerals. And I was going to start with my mother. My mother died, as I say, 34 years ago, which is kind of sobering to think about. I remember when it was 21 years and I thought, ooh, that was a long time ago. When I realized now it's been 34, it's been a long time ago. Although parts of it seem just like yesterday. When my mother actually died, I was in the process of making our favorite dish. I actually had to leave it in the middle to go to the hospital. And she was gone before I got there. But the fact that that's what I was doing when I got that call, with the intention of heading over later in the day, is one of the things that helps me or helped me to come to the conclusion that the details around our deaths are usually just what they need to be. It doesn't always seem that way at the time, but so often you look at them later and they were perfect for the situation. The fact that I should be doing that, of all things. For years, my mother and I made spaghetti and meatballs every Friday night, and we would make it together more often than not. The fact I was making that at the time that her life ended is a perfect kind of detail. The fact that, oh, and hello to Vincent in the chat room who says, I'm a licensed funeral director. That's good to know. In my mind, that is a perfect detail touching on so many shared times together. The fact that I was not present at the actual time of her death, I'm sure was probably for the best. I sometimes tell the story of two friends who who each lost their wife within about 2 weeks of each other, and in totally different circumstances. In the first case, the husband was not present and did not even know anything was wrong until hours after his wife had passed. In the second case, the husband was right there and watched everything that happened. But in talking with both of them later, it became very clear this was exactly what they both needed. The first husband could not emotionally have stood to be there when it happened. He was far too disturbed just as things were. But the second husband was so grateful that he was there. And the reason was that he never had to wonder if there's anything he could have done, because he was right there doing everything he could. And, I've always thought that was another of those perfect moments. My mother, now Ravenwolf has an interesting point in the chat room and says another way you can look at this is that making a meal is about creation, and the fact that the meal was not finished means you have more to create to finish the meal of wisdom. And it could also be part of looking at how the path has evolved. And Janet says, my mother passed in 91. I can remember that it was Thursday, and we always had spaghetti. It's interesting looking back on these things, and I've spoken about my mother's death in chapter 6 of Second Degree, so I don't know that I want to go back over that today. But I've not really spoken about the funeral. Well, I have in places, but not in writing particularly. And it's funerals I want to talk about today. So for my mother's funeral, my mother had what I think we would call a non-denominational pagan funeral. And the reason we chose to do that is we knew there were going to be people there of all kinds of different faiths, and we didn't want to give them anything um, that would be challenging to them, but rather reassuring. We talk about this in the Rites of Passage booklet, how to do that kind of non-denominational pagan funeral. Um, some of the things it did, it talked about her belief in the afterlife in general terms. It talked about um, her relationship with the ancestors in general terms. It talked about the importance of faith itself in general terms. It did not include any extremely overt religious actions because not only did we expect people from many different backgrounds, we got far more than we expected. That the room was literally overflowing. Um, and um, it was, in its way, a joyous event. It was not what I expected it to be. I had expected to have a small role in the ceremony with Lady Crystal leading it. It turned out Lady Crystal was not able to lead it at the last moment, and I had to lead the funeral myself, which was a bit of a nerve-wracking situation. But I was talking the other day about how pagans look at death a little differently. So it was very different for me than it might have been for someone else. In my mind, it basically meant that I was doing a final service for my mother. And giving her the send-off she would have wanted. And in its way, that too was perfect. I knew that everything that could be done to give her the funeral she would like was done. And it was a very good experience. We did have many different people speaking about her. It was a good funeral. It was not the formal Corellian elders' funeral, but that really is a facet of later times. And that funeral, Lady Windy had that funeral. When my time comes, I expect to have that funeral. But my mother's funeral, even if we had done that funeral, we would have, because of the people we expected, had to have made it very explanatory for them. Because you do want to remember that the funeral is both for the spirit of the person being sent off, but also for the people who are still there. And the last thing you want is to make it unpleasant for them. If you are doing something they may not understand, you want to explain it. Now, once you've done that, I don't know if there's anything else to be said, but now Janet says, or Tom says, I sang my mother's funeral song right before the virus hit in 2018. And Janet says, the day of my mother's funeral, after I came home, me and my siblings witnessed a ball or orb of gold pass through the house. Spirits often do show themselves in that form. Victoria Carlson, who we may talk about before this program ends, very close friend of mine in Chicago, one of the leading high priestesses of the 90s, was seen by many people in the form of a ball of light. Both particularly around her memorial stone at a particular campground in Indiana, people often said there were lights there after the fact. And that is something some people will see regarding the spirits of the dead. Some people see them other ways. Some people never see them but only feel them. Um, so that sort of thing absolutely does happen. Now, having spoken a bit um, about my mother's funeral and taking this occasion to honor her memory, I want to talk about your funeral as a pagan. And I was talking about the formal Corellian funeral. I was talking about non-denominational funerals. But the most important part from my point of view is that you get what you want. And how do you do that? Well, you do it by pre-planning things and having your wishes written down. They need to be in your will. They need to be. You need to have an executor who is committed to carrying out what you want. And if you happen to pre-plan it with a funeral home, you're actually a little farther along. And I highly recommend doing that if you're able to. And one of the reasons for this is that in our pagan community, not quite as much as in, for example, the LGBTQ community, but still, it's often the case that the people who are most important in our lives do not necessarily have the status of next of kin, which will give them the right to make those decisions. Therefore, if you've already arranged it, all of those issues are mostly gotten around if your executor is going to enforce your will. One of the things I remember Lady Victoria, who we were just speaking of, she talked about how a number of high priestesses in the Chicago community in the 70s had ended up with radically Christian funerals because the only people who were in a position to arrange them were far distant family members who were in total denial about their being pagan. This is a problem that a lot of pagans have faced. And if you want to avoid that, take your steps before you die. Do not assume you're not going to die. We're all going to die. Sometimes we'll come close and survive it, as I did in February. Sometimes that is not what happens. You want to make sure if what happens after you die is important to you, whether for your own spiritual sake or just for the people who are left behind, you want to make sure that you have made sure it will be done. Because if you don't do that, you don't have a lot of ways to do it after you're gone. Yes, you can maybe haunt them. You can stand over their shoulder and say, no, this is not what I want. But how likely that is to work, I don't know. It certainly is not something to rely upon. It's much better to have your wishes in writing and, if possible, prearranged. I will also say with a prearranged funeral, it's probably good to have your executor let the funeral home know that there will be a tip for it all being carried out well, that there is a little bit more to be received. Because there have been occasions where a prearranged funeral has not been done as well as it might be because it's already paid for. So if they know there's a little more coming, you avoid that possibility. Janet says, I just learned a few days ago that the Green Lawn Cemetery in Columbus, Ohio will now offer a green burial option. So, I mean, these are, and that's a perfect example. If you want to have something like a green burial, make sure it's in writing. Make sure it's already arranged if you can. And hello to Brian in the chat room. And Brian says, may your mother, the beloved LaVeda, continue to look down on us and guide us in all things. I totally agree, beloved mother. we thank you for your guidance. And I have seen you play a role in many people's lives, which I feel has been very gratifying to me as well as important to see. Janet says they are the first in our city to offer a green burial possibility. Now, Christine, hello, Christine, says that a flock of 7 geese flew over the house when prayers were being said over my mom's body just after she died. I didn't take part in that Catholic ritual. I stood on the deck overlooking the lake and trees, and it was then that the geese flew. It brought me my own spiritual peace. And, things like that will happen. I've told the story about how when Lady Bitterwind died, or rather when we found out Lady Bitterwind died, we had just gone to Greenwood Cemetery here in Danville for a crystal web ritual and an ancestor ritual at the site of the family graves. And as we entered the cemetery, an owl flew by us, making its call. And of course, an owl, in many cases, is an omen of death. Can represent other things, and one of the people present felt that it might have a personal meaning for them. But within about 45 minutes, we got the call letting us know that Lady Bitterwind had died on Beltane Day, as it happens. Interesting, Lady Windy died on Lammas Day, Lady Bitterwind died on Beltane Day. And hello to Calvin in the chat room. So natural omens like that will take place. But getting back to what I was saying, especially if you want something like a green burial that may be more difficult to arrange, maybe more challenging for some, make sure you have made that very clear in writing and that your executor is aware. Because otherwise, there are ways it could be disrupted if your next of kin is not friendly to your choices. Now, in my case, my next of kin is my son, John, who is friendly to my spiritual choices, so that's not an issue. But and of course, my executor will be Sir Edward, who obviously is friendly to my spiritual choices, so I don't have to worry about that, but that doesn't mean that you might not. And with my mother, I was in both of these positions, and she did not have to worry about what would happen. But that's not always true for all pagans. So think about that and make sure you've taken preparations that you may need to take. And then how do you do the funeral? There was a time that I believe I had done more funerals than any other pagan leader at a comparable position. Now, this was many years ago. Obviously, in the years since pagan burial grounds have been created, such as that at Circle Sanctuary, that's no longer remotely true. But back in the day, starting with my mother's funeral and following with many others that I either officiated or was involved in, I had quite a bit of experience in this. I mentioned Lady Victoria. I was one of 9 officiating clergy at her memorial. I was part of a great many Icean memorials over the years. Janet says, I plan on putting my last wishes in writing. Well, you definitely should. And I got to see a lot of different ways of handling this. And how you may want to handle it depends on your background. Does your particular tradition have a specific ceremony to follow? The Fellowship of Isis has the Dulce Domum ceremony, which is a very particular ceremony, which in my experience is generally followed quite precisely. A beautiful ceremony. And it has versions for a memorial, a graveside service, a funeral service. It can be adapted in different ways. We have a formal Corellian funeral, which generally, so far at least, has mostly been used only with with members of the archpriesthood, although a few people not in the archpriesthood have had it. Um, but these are a couple of examples of very particular ceremonies, although um, they both can be adapted to different needs. The Corellian formal funeral in particular features a segment, which I mentioned in terms of my mother's funeral, where people talk about the person, where they share stories about the person, which is very normal for funerals now. But I think that it is really one of the most important things to do um, in terms of having such a thing. Because assuming the person has affected many lives, many people will have something to say. Um, and assuming that that isn't quite what has happened, you may want to focus more on um, a less open format. I have seen pagan funerals done in the presence of the deceased, either um, as either in the form of someone who's been cremated and is in an urn, or in the presence of the coffin, um, just like a non-pagan funeral might be. One of the things that does tend to distinguish most pagan funerals is we tend to be very big on using some sort of grave goods to go forward with the person. When my father died, we made sure that he had a few books that he might enjoy reading, a bottle of, I think it was whiskey that we put in, made sure he had his glasses, even though I do not for a moment believe his spirit needs those things. But it's an ancient custom, and they will be there astrally if he wants them. I have a few things that I want to have put in with me when I die, including my childhood teddy bears, which may seem a little odd, but my thought is that they are not something that anyone is going to want to keep, and I would rather see them make that end because they were very important in my life once. And I would want to have my glasses, if only because no one else could use them, so why not have them? I don't know that I necessarily need anything else. We'll see. We're well in advance of that point. But it is the time of life to be thinking about it. And, we were having this conversation the other day about how people often wait to the last minute to think about these things. That is not a good idea. It's much better to think about it well in advance when you are at peace with it, when you are not under pressure, and when you can really think about what you want and not be feeling that you're in any kind of not feeling that you have to worry about it. Now, Ravenwolf says a symbol object comes alive as guides in the afterlife. And not quite in the same way that reality is in this world, so that they can help to usher the dead forward. Well, yes. And Janet says, and he actually meant a simple object, or she actually meant. Janet says, my parents and my paternal grandmother were all buried with a lock of hair from each child. That's a lovely and a very ancient tradition. One of the things that many pagan funerals will do is involve a full ritual. If you do that with a mixed audience, make sure you're explaining what you're doing. Um, and I would keep things fairly simple for that reason. But you want to remember, chances are you're going to have a mixed crowd. You could, I suppose, have a public funeral and then a private pagan funeral, but that doesn't really sit very well with me. It might with you. In my mind, that brings up the question: were you really pagan, or was it some hidden part of your life? For me, this has been my life. Therefore, there will be one funeral, and it will be a Corellian funeral. Um, the idea, and it was the same with my mother, even though it was a non-denominational version of that funeral. It was still very clearly the well, really what we would now call the formal Corellian funeral, minus some of the more extreme steps, um, and basically meant to appeal to that larger crowd who would not have completely understood some of the things that were being done. Um, but it's been my experience when I've done that funeral for a mixed crowd, and I have, that things like the hydrophoria, if you explain it, nobody has any trouble understanding the idea of purification through sprinkling with water. I mean, many Christian funerals do that as well, just in a slightly different way. Um, but I see we've come to the end of our time. We'll probably talk a little more about this subject tomorrow. And I want to thank you for being with me. I love all of you. Watch my page later today. Stuff is coming. And I hope that you have a lovely day. And I will see you again tomorrow. And until next time, let us have our prayer. And then we shall say goodbye. Divine Mother Goddess, Divine Father God, beloved ancestors, we thank you for all that you do in our lives, and we pray that you will be there for us, as we know you will, when our time comes to cross into the other world. You have guided us in this life. We pray that you'll guide us in that life also, and that we shall go forward peacefully and in joy. And we thank you for giving us so much evidence of life after death, and of the good things that spirits experience in that life. We are grateful to you, beloved ones, for this and for so many other things. And we thank you for your presence in our lives, and knowing you are always present. Yet from respect, we thank you for being present. And may you be blessed now and always. And I thank you for your presence here today. And I'll see you tomorrow. I love you all. And until next time, may you be blessed now and always.